So let's get started. So Chuck Dayton is here, our return speaker, and he's been our second speaker of the year who's been on a voyage through the South Pacific. And you didn't run across each other out there, I don't think, did you, Andy? You didn't cross paths by any chance in the middle of the world's largest ocean? I think Chuck's mission was more scientific, but he also had a little bit of fun, I think. So welcome back, Chuck. I'm going to turn this over to you. And here's the mic. It's working right now. Don't click anything, and hopefully it'll keep going.
Thank you all for coming. It's fun to see so many familiar faces. On a 2,500-mile sailing trip across the Central Pacific this summer, I learned a lot about two specific kinds of health. The health of Mother Ocean as an indicator of the health of the planet, and the emotional health of people who care deeply about the planet and who are bombarded with a continuing stream of bad news about the changing climate. We were stunned by the decline in health of some of the coral reefs as compared with reports of people that had just been there a couple of years ago. And you can imagine the emotional reaction of people who were on a journey, one of the main purposes of which was to study the health of coral reefs in finding the decline that we saw. Without knowing it, we did engage in some of the remedial behaviors that psychologists are prescribing for people who suffer from this kind of distress, which is talking about the issues, doing something about it, and being in beautiful places. So I joined the. Can we have some lights on? I know you can't. You got your choice. You can look at me or you can look at the picture. So I'd rather have you look at the picture. I joined the expedition in the Marquesas Islands, which are 4,000 miles west of the coast of South America. So the boat left from the Panama Canal, and 34 days later I joined the boat in the Marquesas, which is part of French Polynesia. It's just south of the equator in sort of the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we sailed through French Polynesia, through the Cook Islands, all the way to Tonga, sailing west, north, and then south. And this is the family of Steele McCutcheon Janis. On the left, the mom is an anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker. Gavin Collins, 19 years old, going on 29. He was the first mate. Brooks is the skipper and dad. And Rowan is a 15-year-old, quintessential 15-year-old. And Brooks was a psychologist. They now have a maple syrup farm in western Massachusetts. And so they're very interested in agricultural production and direct marketing that avoids the sort of problems that we have in the American agricultural and food delivery systems. This is family on Lear, named for a Welsh sea god. And this was one of the most beautiful anchorages in the Marquesas on the north side of the island. And this is Lear. That isn't very sleek looking. She's a steel hull, built from Russian railroad ties in Estonia, outfitted in Sweden, and very, very roomy inside, very safe, very well-equipped boat. This is a picture of one of the bays in the Marquesas, about which Herman Melville wrote Typee. Marquesas are gorgeous, heavily forested, with huge waterfalls. This is the third highest waterfall in the world, and you have to hike a couple of miles in just to see it. And you can't see the whole thing. You can see the top and you can see the base of it up close. So we left the Marquesas and sailed to the Tuamotus, which are not mountains, except underwater. They are the tops of volcanoes, but coral reefs. You know how a coral reef forms in a circle? Well, that's really the edge of an old volcano. The volcano's still there underwater. The middle is sunken down. And so these islands are only about 5 feet above the sea. average, but the places you can see, can you just barely see the islands? Before the days of pardon me?
I just said it's on the horizon in your
Just in the horizon, yeah.
You want to sit down to where, you mind sitting? There you go. Now we can see over here.
Okay, sure. Easier for me too. It's these used to be called the dangerous islands before the days of GPS navigation, because you couldn't see them until you were right on them, and you couldn't sail there at night at all. And so they circle around coral lagoons. They're little motus, or small islands separated by breaking reefs. And as you can see, the houses are only 1 or 2 feet above sea level. So the predictions are that by the end of the century, we're going to have about 4 feet. Some predictions say as much as 16 feet if tipping points are reached. So these people are not going to be here. The babies that I saw being carried around are not going to be able to spend their life where their ancestors did. They don't seem to be too concerned about it. I think these guys think probably the French government will take care of them. But other islands in the Pacific are already beginning to take measures to deal with the rising sea levels. They're supplied by supply ship. They're totally off the grid. They have solar electricity. They have rainwater collected on their roofs. It's their only fresh water. They have a very small carbon footprint for people who have have televisions and houses, and yet the carbon footprint of the rest of us is going to drown out their homeland. We did some diving in the Tuamotus, and the coral and the fish were quite good there. So that was exciting. One of the purposes of the trip was to do reef surveys, where you lay down the tape 200 meters long, and then you record all the fish, the invertebrates, any coral disease, and anything that would indicate the health of the coral. You have to take a test in order to qualify to do it, and you report it to an organization called Reef Check, which then collects all that data. This is citizen science data from around the world. These are butterfly fish, Moorish idol, snappers, and healthy coral. Giant clam, and healthy coral. These are my photographs. Thank you. This was my first adventure in underwater photography. I've done a lot of photography lately in the past few years and really getting into it, but I bought some middle class equipment, so you can put the camera inside a housing and you can push the buttons on the outside, and it pushes the buttons on the inside. But the difficulty with photography underwater is, if you're on land, you can set your camera on a tripod. If you're underwater, the subject is moving, the fish is moving, you're moving, and the water's moving. So it's very difficult to get a sharp image. This is a picture of very healthy coral. And I'll talk more about coral later. This is a Christmas tree worm, or a little tube worm, the kind of thing that if you get close to it, it senses you and retreats back into its shell pocket. Canoeing is a huge sport there. It's the only sport. So every evening, when it cooled off, you'd see the canoeists out working out. Frangipani. So we sailed from the Tuamotus. We had pretty high hopes. We sailed to Tahiti. We entered the Tahiti, came into the island at dawn. And this is the anchorage at Tahiti with the island behind it. Of course, this is where Cook sailed and where Fletcher Christian and the crew of the Bounty mutinied and took the women away, and so it's got quite a history. In the distance, we could see 25 miles away the island of Maria. But the reefs off of Tahiti are dead. Stone cold rock. And I'll talk about the causes of coral death, but here, quite clearly, nutrient pollution was a huge part of it. The only thing the dive operators have to sell is, you can see sharks and a few fish. These are white tips. They're probably asleep. But as you can see, coral health is down, although there were some pretty fish. This is algae, which grows when there's more nutrients present in the water, and we saw a lot of this tubular kind of algae and a lot of dead coral. So we sailed out through the fringing reef of Tahiti towards Maria, which competes with Bora Bora for the title of the most beautiful island in the world. And it is a gorgeous island. This is Upanuhu Bay. And they had a little sailing school there for poor kids from all over French Polynesia. Just wonderful, wonderful school. And we had potluck dinners on the shore with other cruisers who are into that lifestyle. We were actually part of the group that was doing what they call the milk run from the coast of South America across the Pacific, which 150, 200 boats do every summer. But here too, in Maria, the coral was not healthy. This is a kind of coral that looks like wood shavings at the bottom of the picture, and then a kind of a turf coral over the top, and a turf algae over the top, and a lot of dead coral, even though there were fish and the moray eel. In some places, the coral was starting to be restored in Maria, and it was a perfect little experiment because the researchers at the French research station said on the one side of the pass is where the currents take the nutrients from the pineapple plantations and sewage. That was totally dead. And then there were places where you could see little baby corals were starting to come back. So we sailed away from Maria and we visited 2 islands on the way to Bora Bora. And I like passages. I like the time at sea. I like being out at night, sitting in the cockpit and watching the stars. In these islands, Ahe Island and Raiatea, we saw this is a lionfish, which isn't a huge problem in the Pacific, but it is in the Atlantic where it's not endemic. We did see some live coral, but these were places that we'd been told were coral gardens that were some of the best coral sites in the south, in the French Polynesia. And this was by people who've been there within the last few years. And the coral was going. This is a pencil urchin. Urchins are incidentally good because they eat algae, and algae is bad for coral. But as you can see, there's a lot of rubble, even though there's some coral there. So we could see from one of these islands, Ahe Island, we could see Bora Bora in the distance, and the island off in the background is Bora Bora, which sort of beckons you like Bali High in the song from South Pacific, if you recall that. And this is Bora Bora with a beautiful fringing reef, and that single volcanic cone is absolutely stunning above the surface. But here too, we didn't get a chance to dive here because the weather gurus that we used as consultants were saying, if you want to go to Saguaro, which was our next destination, you've got to go now or you're going to be stuck here for a week. So we were there just a few hours, and I had this experience of walking down the street in Bora Bora, which used to be a paradise, and walking across the little channels through which the sewage flowed into the lagoon, and having to dodge traffic and buying French fries and hamburgers, and it just, it was just kind of a feeling like, is this a microcosm for the Earth changing? So we left Bora Bora at dawn, heading for Saguaro Atoll, which to us was the holy grail of the expedition. Janice and Brooks and the boys had been told that Saguaro was the example of pristine ecosystem as the coral has always been. And so it was quite a difficult place to get to. It's 700 miles northwest of Bora Bora, and even though we had 1 or 2 days of good weather on the way, this was a 6-7 day trip. Took us, and we began to have very heavy winds and heavy seas. I like night watches, though. It's like being out in the boundary waters and watching the stars with no pollution in the cleanest air on the planet. But we did have 16-foot waves and 30-knot winds on much of that trip. And when we came into Saguaro Atoll, we got there a little bit early before sunrise, so we had to go past the entrance, which was unmarked, and then fight our way back. So it was a very difficult place to get to, and we felt very relieved and happy when we finally dropped anchor in this little, very isolated lagoon, which is a national park in the Cook Islands, with 2 caretakers, and that's it. And whatever cruisers happen to be able to get themselves there. There were black-tip sharks circling around the boat, and we had a lot of fun swimming with the manta rays, who would come to a particular place to find the cleaner fish, who would then clean them. This is a teenager that joined us in Tahiti, Ben, 18-year-old. And Rowan is trying to fly with them. So there was some nice coral in Saguaro, particularly in areas of very shallow water with a lot of sunlight and a lot of fresh water washing over a fringing reef from the sea. And there's a good example of soft coral. Most of the coral in these pictures is hard coral. This is an example of soft coral. You can tell the difference by waving your hand over it. It moves. But a lot of the coral was already gone. In Saguaro, the paradise that we expected. So we didn't even take a survey. We just did a GoPro survey. I don't know if you know about GoPro cameras, but they're you can use them. You can put them on your ski helmet. You can put them on your canoe paddle. They're underwater. They're very good for underwater. Amazing little instruments. So we did an underwater survey for Reef Check to be able to show them that the place that they had expected and had told us was going to be pristine simply was not. It's a unicorn fish, but you can see how much algae there is on the coral here. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little on coral health and what causes problems with the coral. There are basically two global problems and three localized problems. The problem of chloral bleaching is a big one. Increased sea temperatures as the planet warms causes damage to the reefs, and this phenomenon is well documented and studied. Coral are little animals, so they have to have oxygen. They don't photosynthesize themselves because they're not plants, they're animals. So they bring inside their cells a microscopic algae, technical name of which is zooxanthellae. They bring the algae in, and they provide nitrogen for the algae. The algae takes sunlight and photosynthesizes that into food for the coral, and oxygen. And the oxygen then serves the coral, and then the coral also produces a mucus that on the surface of the coral helps prevent pathogens. Well, when the temperature of the water increases, and the tests show 1 degree centigrade for 2 weeks or 2 degrees centigrade for 1 week, when that happens, the microscopic algae, the zooxanthellae, are expelled from inside the cells of the coral. They aren't quite sure why that happens, but they know that the algae overproduce oxygen, and the coral may think that they're a foreign body at that point and expel them, or their immune system expels them. Anyway, it causes the coral to turn white because the algae produce the color for the coral. So without a source of food, the coral dies within a couple of weeks. So coral bleaching is a serious impact of increased sea temperatures. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that saguaro has begun to lose its coral, because when we went to another place, I'm going to talk about Tonga, which was farther away from the equator where the water was cooler, we had a better experience. The other global phenomenon is acidification of the seawater. As seawater is a huge absorber of carbon. It produces a weak acid, which affects carbonate ions, which are used by coral and other organisms in the sea to build their skeletons. So if you have decreased pH, a more acidic seawater, it makes it more difficult for coral to form. And that also affects plankton. And this is very scary. Plankton is the basis for all life in the sea. Everything in the sea either eats plankton or eats something that eats plankton. Plankton will be affected by sea acidification for the reasons that I mentioned. Plankton produces half the oxygen on the planet. It's a huge issue. It also, plankton incorporates carbon into its own body, and then when it dies, it takes that carbon and sequesters it on the bottom of the sea. So there's a feedback here. If you have less plankton, you'll have less carbon being taken out of commission. This is algae, and algae is a natural organism on coral reefs, but it is kept in check by fish and also by by water which is very low in nutrients. If you increase the nutrients, it stimulates the growth of the algae. And what happens is that algae also produce dissolved oxygen, dissolved organic carbon. And they've just begun to understand this, but the mechanism appears to be that the dissolved organic carbon smothers the coral. Coral has oxygen on its surface that's produced by its little algae, and the dissolved organic carbon from algae smothers that coral. So the more algae you get, the less coral you have. And so nutrient pollution is a real problem, and algae is favored by warmer waters, and as I've described, coral is harmed by warmer waters. Overfishing is another problem for coral, and the reason is that the herbivore fish, like this bumphead parrotfish, eat algae, and they also pick up bunches of dead coral. So when you see one of those beautiful white sandy beaches, parrotfish poop. And this finally is the scourge of the coral reef, the crown of thorns starfish, which eats coral and sometimes becomes epidemic on the coral, which happened in the Great Barrier Reef a few years ago. And the Great Barrier Reef is now 50% dead of coral. So we left Saguaro with heavy hearts, because we had expected so much. We had expected to spend 10 or 11 days there. We only spent 4 days. We had a weather window. We decided to go on to Tonga. So it's easy to think in terms of long time scales when you're at sea. Sitting on deck and you're watching the waves, watching the clouds, watching the sunset, watching the sunrise. I had a watch which allowed me to do that for 4 to 8. And the waves look the same to me here as they did to Magellan, or they did to the Pacific navigators that found the Marquesas and Hawaii and Tonga. So I began to think about these experiences and think how things are changing and how things are changing in the sea. And for the first time, I had this feeling that we're entering a different geologic age. We're entering a different era where things are not going to be the same. They're going to be different. And we may be the last people alive on Earth, us, maybe a few generations beyond us, to see the Earth as it is now. It's going to be different. Even if things change quickly in terms of how we deal with carbon. And I knew that intellectually, but this was the first time I really felt it in my gut, in my heart. And when I tell that to friends of mine who work on these issues, we both tear up. So what do you do about that? How do you deal with that kind of depression, really, or feeling of hopelessness that things are getting worse and there doesn't seem to be any way out? Well, the psychologists begin to analyze this, believe it or not, because it's not an uncommon reaction for people who work on these issues. And there's a little, there's some suggestions for things to do. As I mentioned before, one of them is to talk about it. Well, Lear was an ongoing seminar on carbon and on climate change and on coral reefs and on the health of the ocean. So we just talked about it all the time on watch and went over meals. And Brooks gave a little lecture on it, on the vectors that affect coral. And Janice wrote a blog for Globe, which goes to 26,000 classrooms, about plankton. And I wrote some blogs that got published in on the websites of the Sierra Club and Conservation Minnesota. Although I'd like to find a way to reach a larger audience with this story of the ocean. We know a lot about the atmosphere. We all know that we passed 400 parts per million in carbon. We all know that we ought to try to get back to 350 parts. But nobody knows what the numbers are for the ocean, how the pH has changed, how the temperature of the ocean has changed. The scientists in Maria told us that their measurements in satellite monitoring stations showed that the temperature of the sea has increased 0.6 degrees, 0.3 degrees centigrade in 10 years. Well, that's 3.3 degrees centigrade over the course of the century. If that happens, and it could happen, or it could be worse, or it could be less, but if that trend was a straight line trend, because of feedback mechanisms, it's likely to be worse than that. A coral can't survive that. In any event, we were talking about the issue, we're working on the issue, writing about the issue. The boys are making a documentary of the trip. And we went on to the, and then we saw some whales. And these were a different kind of whale. We couldn't figure out what kind of whale it was. They weren't humpback because they didn't have that big white flipper. And they weren't fin whales because fin whales are 75 feet long and almost ran over Paragus this summer. They were, I think, bride's whales that are about 35 feet. And they were about a quarter mile apart. They weren't swimming in a school, but we saw about 20 of them over a 2-day period. And this is actually my favorite picture of the trip, because these whales were surfing inside the swells. There's a motion of this, the water inside the swell is rolling circularly toward the direction of the swell. So they were actually surfing inside the swell, and then they come up to the boat and they kind of look up at us and they swim near the bow the way dolphins sometimes do. So that perhaps was a good omen that things were going to get better on this trip. There's one of them at the bow. And so we went to Tonga. Took us 5 days. It was a nice sail. Tonga, it looks like the Apostle Islands, if you've ever been there. It's an archipelago, at least the northern group. Tonga has 3 groups of islands. This is the northern group. It's called Vavau. It's famous for a place where you can go to swim with humpback whales for $150 a day. And it's the kind of low hills made totally of coral, probably uplifted by some volcanic action. Getting there, we sailed over the Tonga Trench, which is one of the deepest places in the ocean, about 5 miles deep. But it had gorgeous coral with 100% coverage. As I said, it was farther south than Saguaro. But we were, and following the prescription for emotional health of an environmental advocate, to be in a place like this, where the coral is healthy and beautiful, is so peaceful and so restorative. This is a place where it's been like this for not 10,000 years, but 10 million years. So this shows you how we laid down a table do a survey, and we surveyed either side of the tape and then reported what we saw. Just some pictures of this wonderful ecosystem. This is one trick for photographing underwater is to use a pink cellophane kind of filter. I just taped it on the front of my lens with a piece of Scotch tape. It's called Bastard Pink, but it makes the blue look blue rather than green for some reason. The water, if you don't use it, the water looks a little greener than it does to your eye. This is an example of a reef out of water that it's quite unusual to see that kind of coral above the surface. And there's about a 4-foot tide, so we got to swim across this and look at the coral up close. And the rest of these are just pictures of this ecosystem in Tonga.
What did you say the difference was here?
Colder. Yeah. That's the only difference I could see. You know, I don't, and we may have not seen some reefs in Tonga that were that had been crown of thorns, but we just concentrated on one reef because we wanted to get to know it rather than trying to bop around to a bunch of them. This is an example of soft coral that looks almost like a floral bouquet. These clownfish are fun to photograph. They're always by an anemone because the anemone has stinging tentacles that somehow doesn't affect the clownfish. But they're kind of in your face. If you come up close to them, they'll come up and look you right in the eye. Whereas most fish will skitter away under a rock before you can get a shot at them. This is a regal butterfly fish. Oh. Maybe that's the last picture. So I just wanted to say that in addition to the formulas of talking about it, you can turn it on, turn the light on, and being in beautiful places and doing something as a remedy for ennui and depression. First, I'm not smart enough to know what's going to happen. You know, there's a lot of predictions based on computer models, and I don't think that we're smart enough to know for sure what's going to happen or how things will change, what kind of changes might occur. Nobody knew the Arctic Ocean was going to melt in 2007, but it did. So things could be worse. Of course, James Hansen says if we hit a tipping point, things are going to get worse. But Alan Anderson, who was here a couple weeks ago, as you recall, said, and we had this discussion about hope and optimism, and on and on and on. But she said, my tipping point is the political tipping point, when we get the critical mass to be able to control elections, to get people in office who are willing to do something to deal with the problem. And so I'm not smart enough to know what will happen. And the other part of the formula for dealing with the issue is detachment. It's a kind of a concept from Eastern religion that you do what you can, you do your best, but then you're within yourself and you watch what happens, but you kind of let go of the consequences. You've done what you can. So it's what I learned, I think, from from the illness and death of my first wife is that it's possible to live peacefully with uncertainty. And one of the ways to do that is to try to incorporate joy and pleasure in your life every day on a conscious basis. So that's one of the reasons I'm here. Any questions?
Is some of this work that you did going to be published somewhere so that it's available to share?
I don't know the answer. I know that the boat is working on a documentary. I'm going to try to do an op-ed in the Strip just about the ocean, the impacts on the ocean. So that's a work in progress. There's a constant discussion on the boat about what is the mission, what is going to be the, what are we going to produce here, and they took an awful lot of footage of video, and they're working on that. I'll let you know if it's accessible. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to do my own little book on it, picture book. Yes.
Does the last month the National Geographic had an article on the rising sea, and
I hadn't seen it. I will.
yeah, and the question has to do with not only global water but the increase in temperature that's occurring as well. Does that have an effect on the coral?
Well, first of all, increasing temperature, as you point out, does have an effect on sea level.
Yes. Well, and the temperature of the ocean.
Yes, because, as you all know, warm water expands. And so part of the rise of the ocean is due to increasing temperature alone. 95% of the increase in sea level will come from the melting of the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps. And Steve and I stood on the shore and watched the largest glacier in the world outside of Antarctica 3 summers ago, wasn't it? The Ilulissat. Did you go back there?
2010,
yeah. Yeah, and it was moving at 25 feet a day before. Now it's moving at 130 feet a day. At least it was 3 years ago. I don't know what it is now. The question about increasing sea temperatures, that's what causes coral bleaching. As the temperature goes up, the coral expel the microorganisms that give the coral its food, and that causes bleaching and it causes coral death. And that's one of the big factors that has affected the reef in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Anything being done about the nutrients that are going into the ocean?
I noticed in Papeete, Tahiti, there was an ad for some organization that was working on cleaning up the nutrient pollution. They built a new sewage disposal plant, and perhaps they'll be able to get the coral to come back. There are a number of projects to try to restore coral. One technique is to take a braided rope and tack it to the rock, and the coral somehow can attach to that and start to rebuild. So the answer is yes, but it's too late, and at least for the short term. And but they are aware of it, and they're working on it.
Is the nutrient, how the nutrient is, increased, is that a local impact, or is it also a global impact at this point? Are the oceans themselves getting more nutrients overall? Or is it just like sewage and runoff and so on?
Well, I think it's both in the sense that local nutrient production from agricultural runoff and from sewage clearly has an impact. I mean, we got to be thinking that if there are people, you aren't going to find good coral. Saguaro was the mystery because there aren't any people. There are 2. And then globally, as temperature increases, that favors the growth of algae as well. which then produce dissolved organic carbon, which harms the, yeah, and I'm sorry for all the scientific detail on that. Sarah thinks I should avoid that, but I find it fascinating.
Is there any indication that the coral are moving toward the poles where the water presumably is a little cooler?
Yeah, you know, that's a logical question, and one that I've thought about. If the zone in which the coral, the temperature in which the coral lives is moving south, won't the coral also move south or north away from the equator? And I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, I just.
What's the long, assuming the worst, what's the net effect of losing a lot of coral? Not that we want it to happen, but I mean, where does that lead us?
Well, there's 23% of the species that live in the ocean live on the coral reefs. So, to begin with, we'd be losing 23% of the species. There are lots of species that live out in the open ocean as well, live on plankton. Of course, then you've got the problem of plankton. And if the plankton aren't, the fish follow the plankton. There's a wonderful video that we watched on board from Planet Earth. You know that series about the oceans? And it starts out talking about plankton and plankton blooms, and then the smaller fish come in and eat the plankton, and then the smaller fish swarm in these bait balls, and the other fish come in and attack the bait balls, and so everything follows the plankton. And so I would say in terms of the overall global problem, doomsday, plankton are hugely important. Maybe we can get along without coral reefs. We'll lose a lot of species, but I don't think we get along without plankton. And we are part of the ocean. We've now become part of the ocean. Everything we do affects the ocean.